All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Whoop. Yeah, that's a little bit too loud there. Okay. I will try not to perforate too many people's eardrums. I don't know what it's like for you guys there, but from here, this sounds extremely loud, and I'm already a loud person. Okay, so who is still tired after Metallica last night? A couple of people? Yeah, okay, right. You are the people who know how to rock properly. And just to try and get a show of hands here, how many people are already developers on the Salesforce platform? Okay, a good crowd. And is everyone else sort of like more sort of like a beginner on the platform, sort of like admins, people who are just interested in learning more about APIs and what we've got within Salesforce? Okay, good. Yeah, so my name's Kevin Rakowski. I'm a senior product manager with the Salesforce platform team. My responsibility are the enterprise APIs, which are the core REST, SOAP, and bulk APIs that you use to interact with data on Sales Cloud. Now, the idea of today's session is to try and provide an introduction to the fundamentals of APIs themselves, what APIs Salesforce has available, specifically looking at REST, SOAP, and bulk, and then some of the things that we've got going on within those APIs, which are maybe slightly more advanced, like the use of composite endpoints and API limits. And then finally, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, where if there's anything that we didn't manage to quite cover in enough depth, or you want to try and sort of like stump me with your pet question, we'll have time to do that. Okay, so you'll have seen this a million times so far during Dreamforce this year. During the course of this presentation, we'll be looking at some future capabilities on the API platforms, which are still in development, and as such, they are subject to change. Please make sure that you make all of your purchasing decisions based on currently shipping features and functionality. Okay, so really starting with the basics. What is an API? Well, API, as you might have guessed, is to some extent another TLA, three-letter acronym. It stands for Application Programming Interface. And put simply, it's a way for a client to be able to interact with a server and exchange data. It sounds really simple. At its core, APIs are really, really simple. What we're doing is we're looking to perform basic actions like create, read, update, delete of data on a server. And in the case of Salesforce, objects and records that you have on Sales Cloud. Now, Salesforce takes an API-first approach to building features. All of the features that you get to enjoy on a daily basis with the Lightning user interface is all built on top of the same APIs that we'll be covering here. So when we expose something through the APIs for Lightning to make use of, it's available for all of you as customers. And we find that this is an extremely efficient way for us to develop features. Now, Salesforce has got a wide variety of APIs. We've got, as you see on the left, the core data APIs, which you use to interact with data on the platform. You've got APIs that can be exposed using your own Apex code. We've got streaming APIs that you can use for real-time updates of data, and sort of if anyone's been in the platform events sessions, then you'll have already sort of looked at how this streaming technology is used. We've got the chatter APIs, analytics, metadata, and tooling APIs. Now, for the purposes of our session today, we're going to be focusing in on these data APIs, SOAP, REST, and bulk. Okay, so when we talk about an API call, what's actually going on? And again, for those of you who are already developers, I apologize that we're going to be starting with some of the very, very fundamental stuff, but it's really important for those who aren't already familiar with APIs to sort of understand what these basic fundamental building blocks are. So here we're going to look at what happens with a REST client, and we'll get into what REST and SOAP and all of these other terms mean later on in the presentation. But the basics are that you as a client, let's say that you're using the Salesforce mobile app, and there you are on the left, client. The client will make a request to the server. Now, the resource that we're accessing here is an account object, and you can see that this will be, the URL that we're going to be using is unique to your particular organization, although the fundamentals of how these calls are made will be the same across all organizations. So the client makes the request to the server. The server then goes forward to the database and retrieves the data that's being requested. And in the meantime, the client is sat there waiting for the response. And as the server makes the request to the database, the server is also sat there waiting for the response. And then finally, the database will return the data to the server. The server is then able to return the object to the client, and the client is then able to process the response. And you can see in this example here that the information that we've retrieved for the account object is formatted in a JSON data structure, and it includes basic information about the account. So here, name account, updatable true, label, prefix, et cetera, et cetera. And there's going to be a lot more information in the actual responses that you will get back when you make calls against the APIs, but this is really the fundamental of what an API call looks like. Now, when we're talking about APIs, there are two very different types of API call that we can perform. One is synchronous, and the other is asynchronous. Now, synchronous is exactly what we saw in the previous slide. A synchronous request means that the client has to wait for the response to come back before it can do anything. So as you'll see in the illustration on the left there, that's exactly what we saw in our REST API example in the previous slide. You make the request, the server goes forward, gets the data, returns it, and then the client can continue. Now, an asynchronous request means that the client is actually able to continue and perform other actions while the server side is retrieving data or performing an operation. So here, the client will make a request, and then it just basically goes about its business. It doesn't even wait to get a response back from the server side. Now, although we haven't gone into a very detailed view here, at some point in the future, the asynchronous client will request that server again and say, hey, are you ready? Have you got the data? And if the server side is ready, it can return back the response. And so this really is very effective for very, very large-scale operations. A typical synchronous request will be when you're performing an operation on 1 to 10 or maybe less than 200 objects, whereas an asynchronous request is more effective when you're doing an operation on millions of records. So if you imagine creating a new organization from scratch, you don't want to sit there waiting for everything to complete before you get that response back. So that's where asynchronous API calls come into play. Now, I'm sure that everybody here is familiar with this, but just in case, it's worth also mentioning that there are two very different types of objects that APIs can interact with. First of all, our standard objects, and then we have custom objects. Standard objects are those that Salesforce provides by default within your organization. So for example, business objects like account, contact, lead, opportunity. These are all standard objects that Salesforce provides. Custom objects are the ones that you create, which are specific to your organization and specific to your own business processes. So in the example that we discuss here, let's say that you're involved in the sale of houses and you want a custom property object that stores information about the houses that you have that you're trying to sell. Obviously, Salesforce has no idea exactly what that object looks like, and so you as the customer can create a custom object that stores that data. The APIs, whether they're REST, SOAP, or bulk, will be able to operate both on standard objects and on custom objects. So you can use the APIs for your entire business process, not just for the set of objects that Salesforce provides out of the box. And then lastly, we're going to touch on authentication. Now, authentication is really a very, very huge subject, and it's impossible for us to cover the entire range of things that we need to here in this presentation. That would be a whole session on its own. But basically, what you really need to know in the context of APIs is that authentication is ensuring that an API request has been made on behalf of a valid user. So there are basically two steps that are involved. First of all is the actual authentication of the user. Is this user a valid user on the system? And do they provide authorization for an API call to be made on their behalf? Then the second part is actually providing the credential or a token that demonstrates that, yes, this user has provided the relevant authorization. And so there are two different ways that this can happen when we're talking about APIs. The first is using OAuth 2. Now, this is something that is used with REST-based APIs. There are many different flows that can be used with OAuth 2 because it's more of a framework than it is a standard. So the supported flows that we have with Salesforce are the web server flow, user agent flow, and username password flow. But essentially, what you really need to know here is that through the use of OAuth 2, a user can provide access on their behalf to the API. The API, you will then get back a access token, and you present that with every single API call that you make. So if that access token is not present on an API call, it will be rejected. So you have to have that access token on every call. For SOAP API calls, instead of the access token, you'll be presenting a session ID. It's a similar concept. It's basically a token that you include with each call that you're making against the API, except that here you're using the SOAP login method to be able to get that session ID, and then that will demonstrate that the user has authenticated the API to make requests on their behalf. Okay, so those are some of the fundamentals of API calls. And now we're going to move into the specifics of REST, SOAP, and bulk API calls on Salesforce. So what is REST? What is SOAP? I've been throwing these terms around like everybody knows what they are, but not everyone is going to actually have an idea what that means. So REST stands for representational state transfer. And yes, it's kind of a little bit of a fudge to take the RE for REST, but it definitely sounds better than REST. SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. And I suspect that they started the other way around with this one. They liked the name, and then they figured out what it actually stood for. Now, the primary difference, there are many, many differences between REST and SOAP, but I think the biggest is that REST is an architecture for making requests between a client and a server. It doesn't actually specify all of the specifics of how those calls are made, whereas SOAP is a standardized protocol. It has very, very specific methods that are used. It has a specific data format. There are things that are expected in SOAP, whereas REST, you can definitely be a little bit looser in the way that you implement it, as long as the client and the server agree on exactly what those calls and responses look like. So REST can use data formats in any format, really, but JSON and XML formats are probably the most common. REST is based on HTTP and uses 4 common verbs: get, post, put, delete, which are used to perform actions on different data objects on the server side. Within SOAP, you exclusively use XML data. So you cannot use JSON. You cannot use any other format. It's purely going to be XML. There's something called a web services description language file, or even though it's WSDL, it gets called WSDL. The WSDL file specifies exactly how to interact with the API. So when you're implementing the client side, making requests against a SOAP endpoint, you'll typically download that WSDL file, and that can be used to programmatically generate the code that's needed on your end to be able to interact with the API. SOAP also includes built-in error handling, and of course, because as we were saying, is based, you can download a WSDL file that will generate code. It's language, platform, and transport independent. Okay, so REST versus SOAP, that's great. What does that mean for Salesforce? So the Salesforce REST API provides an HTTP-based REST API for interacting with your data on Sales Cloud. We support XML and JSON data formats. As we touched on earlier on, authentication is performed using OAuth 2 with all of the flows that we previously covered. It's a synchronous API, and typically it's going to operate on one record at a time, which is very, very common with REST. But as we'll be covering later on in this session, you can actually do more complex operations with the Salesforce REST API. Now, the REST API is really well suited for mobile or browser-based applications where you're not performing operations on a very large number of records. Now, the SOAP API, because it's a SOAP API, XML data only, it's also synchronous. You can perform operations on up to 200 records at a time, which is a big difference compared to the standard REST API operation. And we provide both enterprise and partner WSDL files. Now, an enterprise WSDL file is if you're going to be interacting with your data on your organization. The partner API is if you're a partner, as the name suggests, and you're trying to create an application which will work across multiple orgs and the data structures within all of those organizations. So I suspect for a lot of the people within the room here, the enterprise WSDL will probably be the one that you'd work with. But if you're developing applications that will be used by other Salesforce customers, then you would make use of the partner WSDL instead. And lastly, let's talk about the bulk API. Now, the bulk API is used for large-scale data operations. The REST and the SOAP APIs that we talked about previously, you really use those for sort of like interactions, real-time interactions on small volumes of data, less than 200 objects. The bulk API is when you're looking to do thousands or millions of operations. We have two versions of the bulk API available, version 1 and version 2, and we'll take a look at the differences between those in a minute. And we support CSV, XML, and JSON formats. So bulk API v1 is, as the name would suggest, our initial and first version of the bulk API. Now, with bulk v1, you have to take your data and create batches, which are then uploaded to Salesforce. So in this illustration, you can see that on the customer side, we've created the data, created multiple CSV files, uploaded those CSV files all to the Salesforce side, and then on the server side, we'll go through and process them. You'll request the status of the job, and then you'll get the job status back. Now, with version 2, we've really changed the way that you interact with the bulk API. And instead of having to create batches manually and upload them all to Salesforce, you create one CSV file, upload that, and then we will take care of the processing in batches, and you don't have to worry about that at all. So version 2 really is a great way of being able to upload large volumes of data to Salesforce without needing to do a lot of work on your end, take care of a lot of custom error handling logic or anything like that. You just basically upload one single CSV file, we'll go through, process it, tell you whether or not there were any errors, and then you can resubmit within another job. And here we cover some of the differences between version 1 and version 2, because it would be a little bit difficult to get everything from that previous slide. So the biggest difference that we have with today's versions of Bulk v1 and Bulk v2 is that Bulk v1 supports create, update, delete, and query, but Bulk version 2 currently only supports create, update, and delete. There is no query capability within Bulk v2 today. There's also a difference in the way that limits are handled. So in Bulk version 1, we have limits based on the number of batches that you create, so 10,000 batches. If you put one file per batch, that's 10,000 records. With Bulk API v2, we do it on the overall number of records. So regardless of how many jobs you create during the day, regardless of how many batches you create, you will be able to process up to 100 million records per day with Bulk v2. And I just mentioned that Bulk v2 doesn't currently support query. If any of you were at the Bulk v2 query session yesterday in the developer section, or we also have one somewhere around the middle of the day tomorrow, we will be introducing query functionality on the Salesforce Bulk API v2 very soon. So on the left, you can see how you would have to do query today with Bulk v1. As with uploading data, to perform a query, you have to create a job. A job has got multiple batches. Batches have got multiple results. You have to juggle all of this stuff and handle the logic on your side before you can finally reconstruct it back into the data set that you want. With Bulk v2, we're looking to really simplify query and make sure that you can make a single request and get back a single set of results. So this is something that we're hoping to have in pilot in the spring release, and hopefully we'll see this going to GA somewhere around summer or winter. Okay, so I'm just going to take a quick show of hands. Are we doing okay? Are we too slow? Are we too fast? Do people care? Okay, right, so we're going to take basically a quick jump into Composite APIs, and then we'll talk about limits. And then after that, we'll be able to go into some Q&A. So if you've got some searing questions in your mind from everything that we've been covering so far, we'll have some time for that towards the end. Okay, so we've talked about REST APIs, we've talked about SOAP APIs, and we've talked about Bulk APIs. So we said that a REST API typically only performs an operation on one record at a time. But with a Composite API, we're able to take together multiple requests and combine them into a single API call. So this is really a way for us to get around that sort of limit that we have with the average REST API and to be able to do something a little bit more complicated and a little bit more involved. So we can basically take we can make multiple requests, take the response from one request, put it back into the input of another request, and have another operation performed, all within one single call. And today we have a series of Composite API, Composite endpoints available through the REST API. So it's important to note that these are not entirely separate APIs. These are all accessible through the standard REST API, but we have different endpoints that you can use to do different types of operation. So the batching REST resource allows you to perform multiple operations within one single call. So here, let's say that you wanted to update 20 records in one go. The batching REST is a perfect way of doing that. Tree save is if you've got objects which are particularly large and bushy. You start from one parent record, and it splits to child records, that split to more child records, that split to more child records. Typically, trying to create and update those sort of records on Salesforce without something like the tree-safe REST endpoint is very complicated. And so this tree-safe composite endpoint really allows you to do all of that in one go. Composite, as we briefly mentioned, allows you to combine together multiple requests and responses and to take data and perform this more complicated business logic within a single request. And then lastly, Apex will allow you to create your own code on Apex and expose that through either REST or SOAP interfaces. Okay, so that was a lot of words so far. What does this actually look like? So if you imagine that you're trying to go through a little bit of simple business logic where you're looking up a couple of accounts and contacts, you want to see what cases are associated with them, maybe you want to create some tasks and you want to query one of your accounts and sort of see what's going on with them. Using standard REST, you would have to make all of those calls individually. So here you can see that we've got 10 individual REST calls that you would have to perform in order to be able just to do that sort of very simple, very straightforward piece of business logic. Now instead, when we use a composite endpoint, we can actually interleave all of these together. You can see that the case, the task, are nestled underneath the contact, which are all nestled underneath account. And then at the end, we're able to do a query and we're able to do a describe against the case. So to do this, we would basically wrap all of those requests up into the JSON body of the request, and all of the rest of it would be expanded out and handled on the server side, exactly the same as if we'd made all of those individual requests ourselves. So this is a much more effective way of being able to handle lightweight business processes. It is significantly more effective in terms of your limit utilization because previously we were using 10 API calls and here we're using 1. So it's really good if you're up against your API limits as well. Now we have a couple of new composite resources that we've introduced over the last 6 to 12 months, and we're just going to cover those here. First of all is something that we call sObject collections. So hopefully you'll recall when we were looking at the difference between REST and SOAP, that one of the big differences was that SOAP was able to perform operations on 200 objects at a time, whereas REST was typically restricted to just 1. sObject collections is a way to remove that limitation. So now both REST and SOAP can perform operations on up to 200 objects using a single call. Now, we've also made sure that this supports all the same headers as SOAP. So if you have an existing integration on SOAP and you've been hesitant to move across to using REST because of that 200 object limit, this provides you a way to make that migration. A second new composite endpoint that we've introduced is something called mass operations. Now, this is slightly different. This is if you want to be able to perform an operation, a single operation, across multiple objects. So you would provide, for example, a SOQL query, as we've got here, and the results of that SOQL query would all have one single operation performed against them. So if you need to update a large number of accounts in one go, or let's say that you have a large number of leads that you want to convert all in one go using the API, mass operations provides an easy, convenient way to be able to do that. You simply perform your SOQL query, tell us exactly which operation you want to perform, for example, close out the lead, and that will all be done in one single API call without needing to do anything else on your side. Okay, and lastly, let's dive into API limits. Now, nobody really likes limits, and certainly every single time I talk to customers, they're like, why can't you just give us more API limits? Limits are an unfortunate and necessary thing that we have in place. We need to ensure that we have optimal performance for all customers. We need to make sure that everybody has got fair access to the system resources. And we try to ensure that those customers who have larger organizations or who are performing more complex operations have an appropriate number of limits available to them. So typically, we will do this by looking at a base of 15,000 API calls, plus the number of licenses multiplied by the license type, up to a maximum of 1 million. Now, if you need additional API calls, you can purchase packs of 10,000 API calls and just keep ramping that up until you get as many as you need. But we consider this to be a pretty sort of like fair way of providing allocations for most of our customers. However, we recognize the fact that even if this is okay for you in a steady state, there are definitely going to be times when you need to burst above those because maybe you're doing a migration over a weekend or something like that. So we'll just skip through these ones fairly quickly. So if you want to understand where you are in terms of your limits, we provide a number of different ways that you can do this. First of all, you can check where you are in your limits through using the system overview page. So if you're an admin and you just want to go in and see how many API calls you've still got remaining, the system overview page provides a simple, straightforward way of doing that. And you'll see up there in the top right-hand corner, API usage, as well as information about other objects and limits you have on the system. We also provide a pragmatic way for you to do this. Make a call against the limits resource, and that will return back information about every single limit that you have available on your org, and how many of those you've consumed within your particular limit period. And we also have a limit info header. So if making an individual call to the limits resource is too much, then the limit info header is present on the response from every single API call that you're making. So if you take a look at the REST example here, there's going to be a header that will actually tell you specifically how many API calls you've made against your overall limit. And this is a great way of making sure that you're not exhausting too many API calls in a 24-hour period. Now, this is where hopefully everyone's going to go, ooh. Last year, we started talking about soft limits a little bit. This is something that we now have in a proof of concept within the current shipping release. We're hoping that we're going to be able to start taking on some customers in a limited pilot in the next release. And soft limits is a way to deal with the reality of needing to temporarily use more API limits than you have available to you. So let's say that your base limit is somewhere in the region of 15,000 API calls per 24-hour period. But it gets to the weekend, and you need to do a migration to a new sandbox org, or you just need to upload an enormous number of records because maybe you've got an acquisition, you've got a company that's joining you, and you just need to put all those people in the system. We shouldn't penalize you for that. We should allow you to be able to use the system and have these temporary bursts above your limits, and everything should be fine as long as we're not interfering with other customers and as long as we're within the limits of the system itself. And so when you have these infrequent bursts, we're going to just allow those. So you'll peak above your normal utilization, you do your thing, you come back down, everything's fine. Now, on the other hand, though, if we come across an actual system limit, or let's say that we see that the utilization really is excessive, your limit is normally 15,000 and you're making 1 million calls per second or something like that, that would probably be bad. So if you hit the enforcement level, then we'll cut off the subsequent API calls the way that we would today. And then lastly, if we see that you are regularly above your API limit, we will also make sure that we put you in touch with your sales team, try to increase that threshold, and avoid enforcement if possible. And so we hope that this is going to be a much more flexible way for customers to interact with Salesforce and not be penalized for temporary increase above. Okay, we've covered a lot of stuff here. So finally, which API should you use and when? So the REST API should be the API that you use if you're performing operations on 200 or fewer records, you need to use JSON data, or you want to perform composite operations. REST is definitely the more modern integration method, and so this is the one that we would expect most customers to use when they're starting fresh with Salesforce. The SOAP API is typically used with older integrations, but it's really well suited for system-to-system integrations. So for some larger customers that are trying to integrate lots of different data sources of different maturities, we sometimes find that SOAP is the best way for them to be able to do that. Lastly, the bulk APIs. Bulk v1, you should use if you've got an existing integration and you need to use query today. Bulk v2 is a much more effective way of performing these bulk operations and will also introduce query in an upcoming release. And so we would definitely encourage customers to start making use of Bulk API v2 if they're doing a new integration. Now, Bulk v1 and Bulk v2 will remain in use side by side for some time to come. So don't be worried that we're going to be pulling the plug on v1 tomorrow. They're both going to stay in place because customers have got slightly different needs and existing integrations, but we definitely strongly encourage customers to make use of version 2. And then finally, just a quick summary of the APIs that we've been covering here and the differences between them. Won't cover everything there. We've already sort of talked about this in the slides. So I'll just leave that up there for you. Okay, so we've reached the end of the presentation. I'm afraid that I've talked for a long time here, so we've got like 2.5 minutes roughly. But if people do have questions, we've got a microphone here in the center. Alternatively, if you would prefer to come up afterwards and just ask your questions directly, I'll be hanging around the speaker area, and please come down and ask away. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the Dreamforce.